it have to? Recording started. Facebook is there. That was very fast. Okay, everybody, welcome to History Matters. And so does hibiscus and rose premium soda.
You're not drinking coffee?
I didn't have time to make coffee.
And rose. What? What is that?
Hibiscus and rose premium soda. It's very, very good.
Never heard of it.
It's not coffee. Okay.
Mm.
However, there, I had yesterday I was trying to ponder what to talk about, and it wasn't that there was a shortage of topics. I was like, I could do this, I could do that, I could do this. And ultimately, what struck me was just the fact that yesterday's oral arguments before the Supreme Court brought up so many big things, right? There was so many major issues of government being debated, it kind of blew my historian mind. That's the direction I want to go today. But before I go there, I turn to my partner in crime, Annie, who will explain the rules of the game.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Annie Evans from New American History. Delighted to be with everybody, as we always are here on Fridays. If you are new, please continue to engage in the chat. But we hope that you will have some great questions by the end of the next half hour related to today's topic. And we would love it if you would put those in the Q&A. I'll be back in about 30 minutes, and then we'll discuss.
Excellent. Okay. Oh, and I will say one more thing. If you are here for the first time, please say so in chat. We have an amazing community. This is our 202nd episode. We'll see how long I can remember where we are post 200. But for 201 episodes, we've had this amazing group of people here that has truly become a community, and they will give you a robust welcome if you tell them in chat that you are here for the first time, and make sure that your comments go to everyone. Okay. So yesterday's oral arguments, as luck would have it, yesterday was a teaching day for me, and I was meeting also with students, and there was a lot happening. So, I got to my office early before a meeting and like frantically looked to see what was happening. And then I had to turn away and I had a meeting. Then I looked again, and then I had a student, and then I had to prepare my lecture. Then I had to leave the lecture. So I did not have the luxury yesterday, which I would have loved, to just follow along with the oral arguments and with some of the sage commentators on the oral arguments. And I'll be quoting or citing at least one or two of them today. Neil Katyal is someone whose opinion I always really admire on such things. And as he said at some point yesterday, I've listened to over 400 oral arguments, and I've argued before the court 50 times. So he has some good opinions. And conservative Judge Ludwig also, I think, has, and I'll be signing both of them at some point today in my comments, also are people who I look to just for insight and to begin to move my brain in directions that will be helpful. And certainly they think of things and say things as judges and or lawyers and people who have familiarity with not just courts, but the Supreme Court, to really help me gel my thinking. As a historian, I need real sort of law makers of that sort, law deciders of that sort to help me guide what I'm thinking. At any rate, yesterday's oral arguments in the Supreme Court, I'm sure everyone here knows it, but I'll say it anyway for posterity, had to do with what should happen with the Colorado decision to keep former President Trump's name off of the ballot because he had disqualified himself from running for the presidency by engaging in an insurrection. And Maine has already done something similar, apparently, and I didn't find the list of states, but I believe there are 35 other states considering or talking about doing something similar. So this isn't just a one-state wonder. This is a big issue. So that's what the oral arguments were yesterday. Now, generally speaking, and I am not the one to judge this, but certainly a lot of people are saying it did not appear to go well for the folks representing, for the challengers, I guess is the word that they're using, the challengers to Trump, the people who want to keep his name off of the Colorado ballot. And I saw in rummaging around online this morning, some people are suggesting that they didn't do some of the things that they might have done to be effective. I think Neil Katyal said they're sort of along the lines of where I started this morning. There are so many major, not major like, let us discuss democracy major, but big sort of sweeping reasons why this is important and needs to be discussed, that in his mind, the challengers did not address. He thought they became very technical and they were just answering questions. I don't know if I got his comment down here, which is, I found him this morning saying it somewhere. But he thought that they were, I'm not going to be able to find it. See, I did take lots of notes. But as far as like putting them in any actual order, I did not. At any rate, what he did say this morning, what I did see him saying this morning, was that he felt that they became very technical. He was very careful. He didn't say they did horribly. He said it did not go well for them, and I could use other words. But at any rate, he thought that they answered questions, but did not present a positive case as to why they were right, which is kind of serious. Again, I didn't watch or listen to, and never mind watch, the arguments, so I can't pronounce on that, but that's what Neil Katyal has said. And it sounds, based on everything I've read, that might be accurate. Regardless, I think that the general idea that, and I think I said this in the post tweet to whatever everywhere yesterday when I announced finally what I was going to do this episode on. I said something like, there were so many major things being pondered here, like federalism, right? Do states have this kind of a role in a national election? What should be the relationship between a ballot in the states and a national election? Is this a national question? I think Justice Kagan at one point said, I don't know, this seems national to me, right? It's national. So first of all, just the basic question of federalism, which is deliberately blurry, I'll come back to that in a minute, that's being debated. You have just simple checks and balances, right? If people want to discuss very specifically the part of the 14th Amendment that says an insurrectionist, I have the phrasing here, that no one shall be a senator or representative of Congress or elector of president or vice president or hold any office, civil or military, under the United States or under any state if that person had previously sworn as a member of Congress or as an officer of the United States to support the Constitution, but then engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the federal government. So that's the phrase. And then, one of the questions being debated yesterday in this realm of big questions, that's not self-executing, right? So how does that go into play? Like, does Congress have to weigh in on this? So the simple question of checks and balances is being debated. Originalism is in here too. One of the amicus briefs about this that I think was filed on behalf of David Blight and Jill Lepore used very deliberately an originalist argument, thinking, okay, you guys do this all the time. Here we're talking in your language, and sort of threw that out there in an amicus brief. So all of these things, and that's just touching on it, are in play. And the outcome of this could have a huge repercussion. I mean, Justice Ludwig, J. Michael Ludwig, he said, let me find it here, because he had a wonderful quote. So he apparently was on Morning Joe yesterday, and he said, the argument today will be historic. The case is probably the most historic constitutional and political case in all of American history. As a historian, I quake before making statements like that, but this is what he said. Section 3 of the 14th Amendment is the safety net, the Constitution's safety net for American democracy. If Section 3 doesn't disqualify the former president, then in my view, it would not disqualify any person at all. That is to say that the Supreme Court finds itself in a very precarious position today. Undoubtedly, it doesn't want to decide this case, and it will be looking for all legitimate off-ramps to decide that the former president is disqualified, but there are no legitimate off-ramps to that decision. Okay. So he thinks it's the safety net, and that this is the most obvious example of that. And if today that we find, or the court finds at some point in general that they're not going to consider Trump disqualified in some way, then that's kind of taking all of the teeth out of Section 3 of the 14th Amendment about insurrectionists. Now that's there's so many layers of possibility here that could happen or might happen or will happen that everything that I'm saying here today, I guess I will begin by saying there will be 5 ways in which you can counter it, right? So even as that statement from Justice Ludwig says, depending on how this goes, it's going to destroy the safety net for American democracy. There are other legally minded folk who say, well, yes, but the Supreme Court could make an opinion which is very specifically attuned to insurrection in the future. Like the court could come up with a way of having an opinion that actually does decide something, but does it in very specific language. These are all things that I do not have great expertise in. So even whatever I'm talking about here this morning is more along the lines of, I suppose, what we often do here on History Matters, which is to raise questions, to have a discussion, to kind of hash through together what we're watching and what it means, and what history has to do with it. So this is really today's discussion, particularly given that we're still in the middle of whatever the heck is ultimately going to happen, is really going to be in the realm of a conversation and an exploration. But to move on back in on the topic, I mentioned all of these big things that are somehow being debated. One of them that's interesting and that's foremost, and is, I don't think, actually an easy question to answer, but I'll address it at the outset. Coffee, why did I not get coffee? Is the question of whether, let's say that the court decides to let Colorado remove Trump from the ballot, is that anti-democratic? Now, there are a lot of views on this, and you can certainly see why people would argue that it's anti-democratic, that people should be able to vote for who they want to vote for, and removing someone from the ballot means that they can't vote for who they want to vote for. I understand that argument. I did see counter arguments this morning, and I will actually read one here so that you can see the other side. I saw an argument that said it is neither anti-democratic nor election interference to establish a constitution as law, to create a constitutional standard that conditions office holding on certain characteristics and good conduct, to hold a trial at which that conduct is evaluated pursuant to the legal standard so established, and for the court to thereafter make findings of act and rulings of law and fashion, if necessary, the remedy called for by the law and the Constitution itself, which is a very long way of saying, not only is this not anti-democratic, but the process that we're watching now, talking about constitutional standards, putting the Constitution first and foremost, deciding on how we interpret behavior, holding a trial, and in this case, actually multiple judicial proceedings that began in Colorado and now have arrived at the Supreme Court. According to this writer, that is democracy, right? This whole process of debating this and deciding what we think and thinking about it and thinking about outcomes and hearing arguments, that actually is part of the democratic process. That's how democracy works, is you allow these institutions that you've put in motion to structure and fuel a democratic republic to do their work. So I think the quote, and I, of course, brilliantly did not write down, I believe his name was Cole, and I did not get, maybe Christopher Cole. I know one of the brilliant people out there will be able to find this. It was a comment in a newspaper, but he said, the process that we're viewing is ordinary. Only the subject matter makes it momentous. And that's an extreme statement. Again, as a historian, I think I've said here before multiple times, you don't tend to like to say things like the first, the only, the best, because you're inevitably wrong. And I tell my students that if you're going to say that, you better know that you're right. But that said, I think that argument that the process that we're watching right now is important to note in and of itself. Obviously, the decision matters. But what we're looking at is democracy in action. We might all sit here and point to flaws and things about this process and the ways in which partisanship and politics are polluting it. But allowing the process itself to go, you could definitely argue that that is democracy in action. Now, interestingly, one of the arguments made yesterday, which sort of rises into the level of, on the one hand, important and extreme, and on the other hand, what ifs. So some of the discussion yesterday during the oral arguments concerned the what if, like what if we allowed this? And then other states would remove other people from ballots, right? People would declare some other person an insurrectionist and then remove him or her from their ballot, and it would be chaos. I think the phrase referred to at some point, one of the justices called it, I think, cascading outcomes or something. And on the one hand, I think that that is a valid question to ask. It needs to be debated. One of the Colorado representatives speaking, legal authority speaking, said she understands that, but rather than thinking about all the worst case scenarios and what might go wrong and thus why this shouldn't happen, should we not let, if we arrive at a place where this decision makes sense, should we not let the process play out and trust our systems of government to take action if things get out of hand? That I can see why some people would say that might be chaotic. But on the other hand, saying, well, we better not do this because it could get ugly to a certain degree suggests that you're being held hostage by threatening outcomes, right? If you say, well, I better not do this because bad things might happen, that's not that removed from what I've talked about before here on History Matters, which is when people use threats of violence to say, you do this and you're going to pay, there's going to be bomb threats. We're going to do bad things to you if you do this thing that we don't like. And if your decision is then, I guess I'm not going to do that thing, you are in effect being held hostage by the person who made the threat. And I think that's valid to think about. I think these are all complicated and shaded questions. And there's like not quite maybe the whisper, or maybe bigger than a whisper, the murmur of violence sort of, hedging around some of what we're discussing, which in and of itself is alarming. And the fact that that might be shaping what we are doing legally, constitutionally, judicially, we need to really pay attention to that. If we're saying like we don't want to do something that seems legally correct because bad things might happen, that's problematic, right? That's a problem. But again, there are so many layers of what might happen here that I can't be absolute and say, well, the court should do, the court could come up, as I mentioned earlier, the court could have an opinion, but could frame it in such a way that maybe it prevents some kind of damage. I am far from having the expertise to know what that would look like, but apparently that's certainly possible. So whatever we're going to talk about, I'll finish in a few minutes here so that we can really have a discussion. What's important to note here is all of these major issues have been raised by these oral arguments, major issues about federalism, the presidency, our election process, democracy. I mean, I was on those social media platforms yesterday, like, folks, this is big. It felt to me that I wasn't sure people were understanding the size of the possible repercussions of what we're watching here, and the simple fact that in our lifetimes, normal lifetimes, recent years in our lifetime have not been normal, but generally speaking, in our lifetime, there are not necessarily cases like this that put fundamentals of American governance and democracy on the line and debate them. that's what I think had me bouncing up and down in my chair yesterday at my office, just knowing that this was happening. These are big, big questions. And it's unclear. They'll use Justice Luttig used the phrase off ramps. It's unclear what the court will do, whether the court will try and find an off ramp of some kind to have to not make an absolute ruling on this. Who knows? So in a sense, we're having this discussion right kind of in the middle of things. And according to experts, it's probably going to be decided very soon, like within days, they think, because the clock is ticking. And in Colorado, I think is it March when they actually vote? I don't have that information in front of me. But anyway, the idea is this is going to happen soon. So we're in the middle of it, but it's a short middle. At any rate, the larger reason I want to discuss this and open this really to conversation is that, huge things are being discussed. We don't see this happen that much in a typical American lifetime. And it seems important to have this conversation, to discuss this here. And it appears to me likely that we will be having similar conversations between now and November. Whether you want to admit it or not, when people say democracy is on the line, it's not an exaggeration. It's not hair on fire crazy talk. It's a fact. It's just a fact. And I think a lot when I'm talking about politics and history to the public. I think a lot about how to temper my comments, because my personal feelings of concern about what's going on are one thing, and what I think I need to say to the public, that's another. Because if I, beginning now in February, start howling about fears that I actually do have, the howling is going to be drowned out, and it won't mean very much down the road, right? I actually ponder and measure this. Like, how upset can I sound today? Like, how upset is appropriate and will be useful so that people will hear me today? That is the time that we're in. And these oral arguments fall smack in the center, I think, of the simple fact that democracy really is on the ballot, and we're watching that really physically, literally take place. I do want to make one last comment that Neil Katyal made that also we can throw out here. He said he was disappointed. Clearly, he was very careful in his language, but he said he felt that the challengers, the people speaking for Colorado, they didn't deal with the sort of big, significant reasons behind what was behind the 14th Amendment and this third section of it. That they didn't say there had been a massive bloody civil war, and what was the concern at that moment was insurrection. Insurrectionists, protecting the country from insurrectionists. In other words, he really wanted the Colorado representatives, the legal representatives, to really come out and say, not just, well, we've thought through the legal options of this. This is the big issue here. This is what this is about. This is why it's really important. And here's why we should win. He didn't think that they did that. Again, this is beyond my expertise. But the idea that bigger issues should be thought about here, they're there whether we think about them or not. And I thought his point was very valid, somewhat disturbing, but also very valid. I want to open things up for questions shortly. I do want to say what I haven't yet touched on, and we can touch on it in the question and answer period, is the question of what has happened in the past when elections have or haven't been challenged, because that was debated. That's the history part. That was discussed at some points during the oral arguments yesterday, and that's a way in which history can be problematic, because ballots and elections didn't work the same way over time. So you can't actually say, well, this hasn't happened before with a ballot, and thus X, Y, and Z. Balloting and elections have worked very differently over time, and people were challenged for their seats in different ways over time. So oddly enough, there was a moment when my thinking about it and listening, I was like, that question, like, but this hasn't happened before. Speaking as a historian, that's a problematic conclusion. But I will move my notes here. I feel like I talked very quickly there. Yes, mug, mug, mug. Let me also see, I put my notes over so that I can't see the chat. And then in my mind, I'm like, they're probably saying mug, mug, mug right now. Okay. Now the thing with this mug is that I am not the person who keeps track of mugs.
Yeah.
Someone gave me this mug, and you will
Carolee.
have to. It's not a Carolee mug.
No, I think Carolee tries to keep track of it.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I might have used it before, but it definitely seems to be the most appropriate. And it's presidents of the United States. Now these all happen to be actually from Virginia.
Yeah. The first five, or four of the first five.
So yeah.
That's beautiful though. It's very
it is, and it was a gift.
Yeah.
And I don't know who it's from. I want to say maybe Dale, because he sends me Virginia gifts, but someone was going to have to someone, oh, Carrie, someone else keeps the mug spread. Okay. So if you're watching and you gave me this, please tell me, because I am never organized enough to keep track of this ever. It is a very pretty
really
mug.
pretty.
And it just lists all the presidents.
Yeah.
Their signatures, actually, it doesn't even list them. Authentic, it says authentic signatures. At any rate, this seems, I need a PA for a lot of things, Carolee. At any rate, this seemed the most appropriate. You know, the comical moment every morning when I rush to my cabinet and I think mug, mug, mug. Like, what's the mug? This one stood out. Okay, let me open chat so I can see along with everybody else how the conversation goes. Okay, so that's my sort of general comments for this morning. Normally I sort of close out with a moral, but I think the moral here is, you know, the case itself, we might already know. I saw someone say it's all decided, it's all over. You know, everyone is saying it does not look particularly good for Colorado, and that very well seems to be the case. But that's not the point of this discussion. We're not talking about specifically what does this mean for this issue. It's the fact that all of these issues are up for debate. And what does that suggest about the moment that we're in? And what does that suggest about what we're looking at down the road? So having this discussion, it's not important only because it's focused on this one moment. It's specifically, as I said at the outset, because this one moment is like a Pandora's box, and we need to have this kind of discussion.
Yeah. And we have lots of good questions. All right. Clinton asks, why wouldn't every president try to self-coup if there is no penalty for participating in an insurrection?
And, you know, those are some of the calculations that, you know, it's interesting. You think about the realm of constitutional calculations, right? Like, we need to think about the Constitution and what it says, and that sounds very legalistic. And then you get into the realm of, well, if we do X, you know, like I said before, if we do this, then why wouldn't, repeat that specific question, this what if, why wouldn't every candidate, can you repeat it for me, Annie?
Yeah, it says, why wouldn't, he made his own word up, but I like it. Why wouldn't every president try to self-coup if COUP, if there is no penalty for participating in an insurrection?
Right. You know, this ties to a larger issue, which maybe a second runner-up to contingency in what I talk about here on History Matters, and that's accountability, right? That if there isn't accountability for actions, and I say that in a very broad sense, if people aren't held accountable, and particularly if power holders aren't held accountable for what they do with that power, or what they don't do with that power that they should be doing, if they're not held accountable, then it's just power run amok, right? That a democratic mode of governance is, we give power to people, we the people, and we hold them accountable for how they use it, and they are accountable. for how they use it. That's, if you ask me, some of the things that are at the absolute heart of democracy, accountability is a huge one. People being accountable, people who have political power, being accountable for how they use that power, that's huge. And I've said it many times before. I think we're in something of a crisis of accountability, where no one wants to be accountable for anything. People aren't held accountable for things on a sweeping level. Insurrection being a big one, insurrectionists. There are so many ways, and it's big like that, and it works its way all the way down that you want to be able to do something or say something that's, clearly dangerous and not be held accountable for it. You want to, make bomb threats and somehow that's okay because, I'm not going to go off in that direction. But at any rate, there are so many levels, big and small, right now that it seems that people don't want to be held accountable. And if we see it on the highest level, this is something that the founding generation thought. Like, if the people who are in national government behave in a certain way, everyone else will see that as an example and they'll think they can do the same thing. And I think there's logic there. That if people in power think they can get away with certain things, why do we not all think we can get away with those things? Which is a variation on that question. But I think it's one of the many reasons why accountability and in this case precedent, but accountability is a pretty huge issue here, that you should be held accountable for cooing. You should, so that someone else who tries to coup can't, because they'll know it's wrong. And if you don't declare it wrong in some way, you've just declared it right.
Right. We have 24 questions. I don't remember ever having more than 12 or 14. This is crazy. I just looked at the number. I was like, oh my gosh, we have 24 questions. Okay. Gloria asks, how would you define insurrectionist? Were abolitionists insurrectionists?
Were abolitionists insurrectionists? Well, not necessarily. So, and this is, okay, so this is something I didn't get to in my comments because we've talked about it many times, but this, of course, anyone knowing me knows that I was thinking about this all day yesterday too. Part of what was happening is, what is an insurrection? Is the president an officer, quote unquote, right? That there were debates about very specific words and the meaning of those words. And of course, that's an originalist way of thinking about the Constitution. That's along the lines of, I don't think I took specific notes here. I want to peek for a second. The amicus brief that was filed for my colleague David Blight and Jill Lepore, I think I did have a quote from the lawyer who, yes, okay. So the lawyer who filed that brief, she said, our goal was to bring an originalist historical perspective to the Supreme Court as it considered the meaning of Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. It demonstrates that Section 3 was intended to automatically disqualify insurrectionists. It was intended to apply not only to the Civil War, but also to future insurrections, and it bars anyone who has betrayed an oath to uphold the Constitution from becoming president of the United States. So that person is using an originalist argument, but again, is trying to get at what specifically insurrection means. You can look it up in a dictionary and see what it means. By my view, an insurrection is someone trying to overturn the government, typically by force. Abolitionists, many of them, some of them were using the legal system. Some of them were using protest. Some of them, there are any number, there's a huge spectrum of ways in which abolitionists were trying to get slavery abolished. That does not mean that they were insurrectionists. And I think that's important. Protest isn't insurrection. So, it may seem obvious, but I'll say it anyway. If what happened on January 6th was really angry people had stood outside the Capitol and held up guillotines and screamed things, they would be protesters. But when they stormed into the Capitol, seemingly wanting to get to members of Congress and banging down doors and breaking windows and trying to get into the chamber and carrying whatever those things are called, the sort of plastic ties to bind people up, and some of them were armed, then that is not just a protest. That is now moved into directed action, in this case, to stop the election of a president. To me, that qualifies as insurrection. But not all abolitionists were trying to overturn the government and trying to get slavery abolished is not necessarily the same thing as trying to overthrow the government. So the very short answer is that it's very important. Half of the question that we need to actually talk about what insurrection is really important, and it's going on all around us right now. But generally speaking, most abolitionists, I wouldn't say were trying to overturn the government. They were trying to change it in a dramatic way, but they weren't necessarily trying to overturn it.
Yeah.
Zip ties. Thank you very much, Tom. Yes.
So this one, I like the beginning of this question. This comes from our friend Daniel. It says, simple engineer reductionist question here.
Okay, it's a little daunting, but yes.
Yeah, it says, it seems like the law/constitution is clear, but the defense is complaining about the consequences of following the law. This SCOTUS seems to ignore consequences on everything else. So are they just being hypocrites?
Oh, interesting. So the behind the question is the idea that in this case, the court is bending over backwards to think about what happens if we do this, but that they don't normally do that. I mean, that comment is being made by a lot of people, and understandably, right? And it's, on the one hand, you can understand why that's being discussed. On the other hand, if the court is saying we're afraid to do something because bad things might happen, that's problematic. And that's, as in much of what we're talking about here, I keep saying there are layers. Like, this is the most obvious thing in the world to say. This is not straightforward stuff here. And it's getting to the heart of democracy, which means it in some ways, some of it is straightforward, and in some ways, some of it really isn't, because there's a spirit and an ethos and a will sort of buried within democracy that fuels everything else, and we're sort of touching on that right now. And I lost track of the question.
The engineer reductionist question. It seems like the law constitution is clear.
Oh.
The defense is complaining about the consequences of following the law.
Right.
So it seems like they're ignoring consequences on other things.
Right.
Being hypocritical in this case.
Yeah. No, I think the question of how do you consider consequences is huge. And I do think, as I said before, if the reasoning here is, if we do this, bad things might happen. I'm not saying that needs to be entirely dismissed, but boy, you can't just go along with that train of reasoning. That, as I started out earlier by saying, then you're just being held hostage by people who threaten to do bad things. So that you really, this is complex stuff, which I do not in any way pretend to be a specialist over, because it's combining politics and constitutionalism and the judiciary and so many other things in a way that, most experts are going to have part of that and not all of it under their wing. And certainly as a historian, my wings tend to move in different directions, but these all, history tells us that these kinds of moments can be defining moments. And I suppose that's part of what brought me to this subject this morning. It felt to me yesterday and continues to feel to me in ways that we cannot predict. This is one of those cases that can have a big defining impact. I gather that Justice Ludwig agrees with me. And that we need to at least be aware of the fact that that might be unfolding in front of us right now, and to think about what that means as we're doing here in our conversation this morning.
I think that teachers will use the historian's brief that they sent for years to come. Like that.
There are, yeah.
And yeah.
The briefs. So I do want to, for 1 second, say that the numbers of briefs filed by historians, that makes me beyond happy. Like that, yeah. That's that's part of what we should be doing. We should be doing things like this, where we have conversation. We should be standing up and saying, here is what history tells us, and we know that because we're trained historians, right? So court, that sometimes likes to claim things about history that historians all like bang their head against the wall and say, yeah, no, not really. It's wonderful that historians are speaking up and saying, no, So we're specialists in this. Here's what the history tells us. Now you figure out what to do with that.
David Blight's a national treasure. I dare anyone to fight me on that. Okay. Linda asked if you can talk a little bit about Griffin in this regard.
I actually do not have enough specific information to talk about Griffin. I was reading around it this morning. I know it was talked about a lot yesterday during the arguments, but I don't want to venture out there because I'm going to say something supremely not right.
Okay, we're going to move on because we have 20 some other questions. Rich Houston, our buddy Rich, asks, in strictly political terms, would it be better for the Republican-leaning justices to support removing Trump and get Haley in as the candidate since she seems to hold better against Biden?
That I don't know. What I can say related to that again, in reading this morning, I saw people talking about, and again, it's the sort of thing that one would wish is not being considered in a Supreme Court case, is that there's the immunity issue still hovering. And some people are saying, well, maybe if the court thinks if it's like leans in a friendly manner towards Trump here, that it'll be better set up to not be a Trump friendly in the immunity question, which kind of doesn't feel to me like the way that the court should be reasoning, right? But I have seen other people, again, reading widely this morning, there are some people saying that, it might be that the court in this beyond politicized moment is thinking about that. I think this case needs to be decided as this case, and that case needs to be decided as that case. And the larger question of the court as a political institution, a politicized institution, that's another question. But that's another one that, among the major things that we find ourselves swimming amidst, the question of the court discrediting itself. And I'm not saying it's doing that here, but I'm saying generally speaking, the idea that many people feel that the Supreme Court has discredited itself by being so partisan, that's yet another thing to throw in the mire of major issues that are at play right in front of us. I talk about historian brain and citizen brain and all the other brains, and there's the Carolee Mug, I think, who made all my brains. Yeah. Historian brain, like this is one of those moments when there's the greatest kind of I don't want to say divide, but it's really obvious to me that those two brains are in a different place, because citizen brain is with everyone here, I think, going, holy smoke, like what the,
yeah.
Hey, like some version of hair on fire or moving to hair simmering and about to be on fire. Right? Citizen brain is alarmed and upset. Historian brain can't be all those things, but some part of historian brain is like, this will be an interesting historical moment to come, and historians will be looking at it in this way, and this raises many interesting questions. And what an interesting moment when you can really see that democracy is always a process. And so historian brain is doing its own thing over here in a way that makes sense, because this really is a moment that historians and political scientists in particular are like swallowing and processing, and they should be. But that's on such a different level. Some part of me is standing far back and like looking at this moment as a scholar, some little part, and the rest of me is citizen brain. But there is part of me that is just, which is why I think yesterday I was so trying so hard to communicate on social media the significance of this moment, because I just think it's easy to overlook that. It's like, oh, it's another political case. We have a lot of political cases. It's the court. So much is happening in the court these days. And this could be one of those, cases that we will know. Brown v. Board of Education, there are cases that we know what they do. I don't know, but this is in the realm of having that kind of a massive shaping impact. We don't know yet.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to try and combine a few of these because we still have like 20 questions.
Oh my gosh, and we have like 10 minutes.
Okay. I know. And so people Tim and a few others, Rabbi Beth, were asking about, is this the most corrupt SCOTUS we've seen? And what implications come into the process if this is truly going to be the destruction of democracy with these implications. That was actually
Okay.
Gloria and Tim mashup. I'm going to do
I won't say it's the most corrupt court. Again, I just said I'm a historian. I don't like to make those claims, but generally speaking, I will say, and we've talked about it on a previous episode of History Matters. I don't know when. I am now, as I've said before, at the point where before I pick a topic, I have to like cycle through the past ones to see like, how did I talk about this before? And I just lost track of where I was going. You guys, soda ain't doing it. Oh, corrupt. Is it the most
corrupt SCOTUS? Yeah.
right? Is it the most?
And is this really the end of democracy? If that's true, is
Right,
what Gloria
right.
added.
So yeah, is it the most corrupt court? The earlier History Matters episode that we did on this, one of the things I discussed was that the Supreme Court, in one way or another, is always political. It's not as though it has been outside politics forever and then somehow suddenly became political. And I think we tend to think of it as outside of politics. And so that's not quite right. And that bleeds into this question, right? Is it corrupt? And part of our answer might be, well, look how politicized it is. Well, it's not as though it's been totally out of politics in the past. I think the question of ethics and the Supreme Court is an important one. I think a code of ethics for the Supreme Court would be a fine thing. I think there are obvious conflicts of interest, particularly regarding this case that appear to be just not being addressed, like someone being married to someone who is involved in something that has something to do with this case. I don't want to say it's the most corrupt, but I would say there are aspects of this court. I'll be general in that way. There are aspects of this court that, to me, show the screaming need for some kind of ethics code that is in some way enforced. Because, like many other people, I think Justice Thomas should have recused himself.
That was another question. So we can now knock that back to 19. Yeah. Also, George Tonkin gave you that mug that was brought up in the
George Tonkin.
Yes, and George is with us. So thank you, George.
George,
that's the most beautiful mug.
Okay, it's a beautiful mug.
It's the classiest, I think, for sure.
It's very classy, and I didn't mean to forget you. I always tell people I'm a historian because I'm bad with names and dates. I'm really bad with names and dates. But I greatly appreciate it.
Yep. Okay, so gosh, so many questions. People are asking, this is from Tom Pinellas, would accepting the cascading outcomes argument mean we are giving up on the ability of our institutions to distinguish between valid claims about insurrection versus frivolous ones, to decide cases based on fact and law, to fall willingly into the post-truth, post-fact abyss without resistance?
I think I agree. And I think basing a decision based on, cascading possible outcomes, not even definite, possible outcomes. This might happen and it might be bad. That should not be the basis for a decision. It certainly can be considered, but it can't, if a Supreme Court decision is grounded on the idea that, bad things might happen, so we won't debate this actual thing and its larger repercussions, because in a sense, that's the most superficial of reasonings. To say, well, this might be bad. Yeah. And it might be bad in other ways too. I think it was Neil Katyal yesterday who said lots of people are talking about the cascading outcome of what if this goes in play, and then lots of people are removing people from ballots for all kinds of reasons, claiming they're insurrectionists. And Neil Katyal said, yeah, well, what about the cascading effect of allowing an insurrectionist to be president? Why is nobody talking about that? That's a cascading outcome, right? That's an equally disastrous thing that could happen. And I suppose that's along the lines of what Justice Ludwig was saying, right? That that if this defangs, this could just totally ultimately say Section 3 of the 14th Amendment just doesn't apply really much at all. And if this particular situation can't be captured in that net, then nothing is going to be captured in that net. I don't know.
Okay. People are asking,
And I do want to say, Gloria says implications are important. Yes, I'm not saying implications are not important. I'm just saying that they can't be the only basis for a decision, but they're vitally important. Of course they are. So I don't know if you're saying that, Gloria, in response to me, or if you're just saying that sort of in general, but either way, of course the implications are important, but saying, uh-oh, bad things might happen, so we shouldn't act, it's not that easy. And that might be very true, and that might ultimately cause a decision to be made in a certain way. But in matters of law, there are so many layers that need to be considered. That has to be one of them, I guess is what I'm saying.
Quite a few references to the Colorado case. Jean asks, she says she doesn't understand why the decision that Colorado is correct wouldn't disqualify Trump from every other state's ballot. Like, why would we have to do it individually 50 times if 50 states were to do that? She says, do we not have a way at the national level to pre-qualify candidates? You know, and she knows that states' rights is being brought back up into this, but she's just wondering your thoughts on that.
This gets us back to federalism, right? That different states have different things in certain ways that they do in elections. You know, this has to do with Justice Kagan yesterday saying, like, this seems like should be a national question. It's not a state question. It's a good question. You know, I've said before, I've talked before about federalism here on History Matters, and the idea that it was deliberately left undefined because at the time that the Constitution was framed, national was terrifying. We were moving from sort of separate semi-nation states that came together under the Articles of Confederation to form a confederation that still generally was composed of pseudo nation states that sent kind of like diplomatic representatives to a confederation Congress. And then suddenly people say, no, a national constitution, this is great. And that's terrifying. And the word national in the original Constitution doesn't appear because it was too scary. It was consolidating and massive, and it was going to overwhelm the states, and it felt monarchical. And there are any number of reasons why national was scary. Federalism was one of the main reasons why the Constitution was created and ratified, was because federalism said, you know what? Two levels. The national government is going to be clearly responsible for some things. State government's going to be clearly responsible for other things. And then there'll be some things that we don't know, you know, like they'll be figured out to come. Didn't say it obviously in that kind of wombly language, but federalism essentially says different levels, different things. And over time, we've seen in American history how that comes up again and again. Should this be a state issue? Should this be a national issue? It's decided one way and then another. It bounces around. The ill-defined nature of federalism and the fact that it allowed people to say, oh, okay, states still have power, even though there's a new national government, that's what allowed the Constitution to get passed and ratified. But that, of course, that very flexibility and amorphousness of federalism that in some ways can be a good thing, can also be a problematic thing and sometimes a dangerous thing. And we're watching, among the many things we're watching right now, one of the many ways in which what's being debated is, like, how does that, like, what is national and what is state? In one of the, you know, biggest questions we ask, which is, you know, who can be president and how do we decide that, and who can be disqualified and who disqualifies that person from being president? So federalism is brilliant. You know, James Wilson did a fine and wonderful thing by deciding or helping to concoct this idea that you can have different levels of sovereignty, basically. Brilliant. But it's complicated, and we're stuck smack in the middle of a major kind of complication from the ill-defined, deliberately ill-defined nature of federalism.
All right, we are a minute
we
away.
Have a million questions, and we
still have 15 questions.
Oh,
but some of them are like super short, and I'm just looking to see if I can combine. Rabbi Beth asked, could the court split the difference, not disqualifying Trump, but then not finding him immune from prosecution? Would that do it? Maybe.
Well, I think that's, you know, some people are saying that that's kind of what they're setting themselves up to do, right? That they're saying, okay, well, you know, in this case, we'll kind of go in this direction, but then we're going to say, no, he's not immune. And then will be balanced. I don't know. This is beyond my area of insider knowledge. But I know people are suggesting that that's part of what the court is thinking. I just can't, I have no way of knowing that or judging that. If you go online and read legal opinions and political opinions and other such opinions, you'll see people suggesting that that's what the court is doing, perhaps, and debating whether that's a good thing or a bad thing.
All right. Dave asked, what is the history of SCOTUS judges recusing themselves on cases? Did Thomas taint this whole decision by not recusing himself, given his wife's role in January 6th?
Well, the second question, I think he shouldn't be hearing this case. I just don't. It's a conflict of interest. How is it not a conflict of interest? I mean, explain that to me. How is it not a conflict of interest for someone to be ruling on whether the president engaging in an insurrection means that he can be off of a ballot when that person's wife was involved in some way in the insurrection? That just seems kind of obvious to me. Again, how it is that that didn't happen, I cannot tell you. But if the question is, doesn't that seem to taint things? I'm not thrilled with the fact that he's there. I find that very hard to accept. There are a number of things about Justice Thomas that I find it difficult to understand at the moment, or even, let's say,
still there.
A lot of things, and how they're just going on, right? This gets back to the point I raised earlier. That's like, ethics code, an enforceable in some way ethics code. I don't know. Like, again, we're now moving out of the realm of history and into the realm of how government itself functions from an insider view, and I don't have that insider view. So
we might not need to have a part 2 next week, because we still have 12 questions and we'll have a decision by next week. So
well, why don't we say that? Why don't we say that we will? So here's what I will say. We will do this again next week. There will be more said all this coming week on this. So there will be more to say. We'll be able to not only address questions, but you can think about and come with and even send in more questions, right? So that we can, so we can, this deserves a part 2.
Does. Claire, can you make sure you send the ones that are left? Because I don't have a way to save those. Can you send them to Joanne and me?
Excellent. Perfect. Cool. That is a fine idea. See, now, but now
that's because I had coffee.
Pardon?
I had that idea because I had coffee.
And I didn't, because I didn't.
So we have some solutions for that. We'll talk about in the after party, Joanne. We have a couple ideas for you on that.
Okay. Yeah. But I do want to say, before I give my sort of normal closing, I want to give a sort of an extra gloss on it. And that is, look at what we're doing here, folks. This is an important moment. It's a complicated thing. It's a major constitutional thing, and it's going to play out in front of us in the next however many months. And we're talking about it here, and we're figuring it out together here. And that's what we're here for. This is what we do. And now, by this point, 202, we're a community that can do this. Can you imagine if this sort of thing was happening in lots and lots of places, and Americans were coming together and debating these things and talking about them and having actual conversations, not screaming fits, and trying to figure things out? What a good thing that would be. A friend of mine who's a journalist, said, this should be repeatable. Like what you do, there should be lots of it. It should happen everywhere. It's like, it could make democracy work better. And in this particular case, it's so much what we're doing. It's always important what we're doing. I always say thank you for engaging in democracy on a Friday morning, but this is such an obvious example of that, particularly given it's still in the works and we're figuring it out, right? We're figuring out what we think, we're figuring out what it seems like, we're decoding it with each other. Like this is democracy. This is, if it sounds sometimes that I'm like all cheery, like, thank you for engaging in democracy, this is what I'm talking about, right? This is precisely what should be happening in a lot of places with a lot of people who have questions. This is a weird, complicated thing. Okay, I'm going to stop. I'm bouncing up and down in my chair. This is, Carolee, this is democracy. So not only thank you for engaging in democracy on a Friday morning, Thank you for proving that this is possible to do and how important this is and how we can work through these things together. It matters. It maybe, maybe in my lifetime, it hasn't mattered as much as it does right now. And so us being here to do this together and showing that it can be done, that matters a lot. But as ever, also, huzzah! I like the huzzah. Such a good word.
Like huzzah.
That's right. We need it. We need maybe a mug that says, "This is democracy."
With huzzah on the back.
With huzzah on the back. Oh man, that would be an excellent
That'd be a
mug.
great mug.
At any rate, I do want to thank you all for being here. We will be back next week, continuing to talk about this with, I'm sure, new and ever so interesting implications that will be suggested in the next week. And we'll see where the discussion goes. Dave, I'm going to come back to your comment in the after party about Instagram. We'll come back to that. So thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you, Claire and Annie, and I don't know if John's lurking out there, but and Jessica, thank you to everybody for being here and making this possible. Like this is a big club, but I feel like Claire and Annie and John are like my extra special club buddies, so thank you very much, because it doesn't exist without you. You're huge. At any rate, okay, I'm gonna tell you what happens now, because we're like way over. Here's what happens now, folks, because I think there are probably some people who are here for the first time. We are now going to go to the after party. What that means is that we will stop recording so that we can be even freer and easier than we just were, and we can talk about whatever we want to talk about. If you are watching on Facebook, you need to leave Facebook to join the after party. So if you are here already watching us through the NCHE website, stay right where you are, and poof, you will be in the after party. If you're on Facebook, you need to go to ncheteach.org/conversations. That's ncheteach.org/conversations. And then you too, poof, will be in the after party with us. Okay, everybody, have a good week. We're going to segue to after partiness. And I will be pondering this all week. Look at this. I don't have to decide on a Thursday, like, what of the week will I be able to do and focus on? We already know. And this will be good. I can have a sense beforehand of some of the things we get to talk about. And you can think of more questions, because boy, there are going to be a lot more questions we're going to want to ask. So, okay, we can segue. Look at that. People are already sending more questions.